Oh, I didn't yet, but I got it. No, apologies. Is oh, you think? Unfortunately, recently the stuff that I have to do is not stuff I should have to do. It's been the stuff going on in the finances of the university, and I run two programs. I run a program here and a program over there. Sometimes politics gets in the way of education and above my pay grade, I thought. that's the better way of putting it. Like, I thought I never wanted to be an administrator. It's the whole reason that you don't apply for jobs like dean and provost. Like, you don't have to do this stuff. It is what it is. I feel like sometimes I wish that he was a little bit less on the nose about it, but I feel like God doesn't give us more than we can handle, but sometimes he gives us more than we want. So it's you know, I had a we had actually we had a guest pastor for our temporary pastor at my church this Sunday. I go to Beautiful Savior here in Mequon, and our previous pastor retired at the end of last year. You may have had him for a class. Pastor Hillenbrand. He taught, I think, Bible. He teaches the Bible class here. So he's retired. So we have like this stand-in guy. Well, he was gone this week, so we had a stand-in for the stand-in. And he gave an interesting sermon, really talking about how Peter started getting kind of over his skis, thinking that he was like, oh, we're kind of famous here in Jerusalem. We should go in with our heads held high, kind of getting a little greedy, human greed getting thrown in there. And, Jesus got a little upset with him. That's not kind of what we should be doing. I don't know, just kind of spoke to me that, we kind of live our lives in this comfort zone, and anything that pulls us away from that is we get afraid of, and you don't like the challenge. But I don't know, sometimes it wakes you up, makes you see what's actually important. So I don't know, felt like one of those sermons that was the right time, right place. Didn't necessarily make me feel better, but maybe made me accept some of the challenges I'm dealing with right now a little bit more than I did the 10 minutes before that. So we'll see how that goes moving forward. All right, so let me get Keynote open here. So for starters, my plan is to, and actually I'll go through the slides here a little bit, just as a kind of a quick review, and then we'll get into the homework assignment. But my plan is to write the midterm today, and probably get it up on Blackboard. Here, let's say by noon tomorrow. I'll probably put it up tonight, but let me give myself some wiggle room. And then what it'll be is you can do it whenever you want during this week. I'll probably give you a 2-hour time limit. It'll be designed to take 1 hour. But you just need to you got to do it all in one sitting, and you need to submit it by, let's call it midnight Friday, right? 11:59 p.m. Friday. That way I can grade it over the weekend. Remember, we're on spring break next week. I will have the grades up before that. I plan on having the grades up actually probably by end of day Sunday might be the goal. When we come back after break, remember Monday and Wednesday, we won't meet for class, but there will be lectures up for class, and there will also be homework assignments. I will still be in the middle of an ocean, probably still dealing with the same emails I'm dealing with now. So, here's what it is. But in any case, you'll have your grades for your exam well before that, and any midterm grade stuff. I will also reach out to you if I think you're in substantial trouble after the midterm. So if you don't hear from me, you can assume that at the very least, I don't think you should drop something like that. Remember, my policy is if you do better on the final exam than you did on the midterm, I'll replace whatever exam grade you got on the midterm with what you got on the final. So if you really come in and train wreck the midterm, I just have a quick face-to-face with yourself and decide, why did I bomb this? And if it's adjustments you can make, maybe spending more time in the assignment, maybe asking for help earlier, whatever it is. I'd encourage you to make some of those adjustments and come in and do much better on the final and erase your poor midterm exam score. All right. But if I think that you have maybe chosen the wrong vocation, I will reach out and I will let you know. Doesn't happen very often, but does happen. And I tell you that it's kind of out of love. I don't want you to throw good money after bad money when you're just in the wrong thing. And see if we can pivot and get you into your right area where you can excel. Everybody wins. Okay, so let me kind of go through our slides a little bit. So for starters, there will be some Unity stuff on the exam, but it'll be very high level. I'll talk about that here in a few minutes. So a majority of this exam is going to be dealing with programming logic. All right, so I'll be asking questions. If you've had my class before, if you were in 200, and I like to ask questions dealing with manipulating strings, like write a function that does A, B, that takes 2 parameters and does something with them. Show me you can write some logic, should be able to define variables, ask questions, write loops, work with strings, possibly doing something with recursion on this exam. But the questions are typically kind of a different nature than the homework, but try to drill things that you should have learned from the homework in terms of getting more proficient at programming. All right, so the exam is focused on programming, not focused on the inner workings of Unity or something like that. Go ahead. Yeah, I'm fine with that. Yeah, I mean, my encouragement would probably be use Java or C#, but if you like one of these other languages, that's fine. In fact, I'm even fine with Python. The one thing I would tell you, and you've maybe heard me say before, I definitely said it in 200. One of the reasons I don't like using Python in some of the early programming classes is Python has too many built-in functions to do certain things. So you're kind of encouraged to take shortcuts and not actually get good at some of the logic stuff because Python just has a quick function that does it, which is all fine and dandy once you're a professional programmer trying to, get more done in a shorter period of time or something like that. But bottom line is, when I'm asking you to answer a question, I basically am asking you to do it in terms of what you've learned in class. So if you choose to use Python, that's fine. Unless we introduce some built-in function in class, don't use one of their built-in functions. Python has the ability to turn a string into an integer. That's fine. Java has the same thing, integer.parseInt. So you can use stuff like that. But if you feel like you're writing the entire answer to the question in like one line of code in Python, probably not doing it the way that I wanted you to do it. All right, so you could pick whatever language you want, but I'd probably encourage Java or C# or C++ if you prefer that, but I don't care. Just show me you're competent at the programming. Remember, my belief is the language doesn't matter. It's the programming is the actual skill set. So the exam will be focused on finding your current competence at problem solving with a programming language. All right, so definitely make sure you're comfortable with variables, the conditionals, loops, writing functions. Definitely the idea of static versus non-static. Know how to call those guys. It'd be entirely possible for me to give you some, a function with the documentation for that function and ask you to use that function to solve some problem, even if I made up the function. I might say there exists a function named ABC that takes this as parameters, and I give you the heading for the function. If it's static and I tell you it's inside the class called LOL, you should say LOL dot whatever the name of the function is. Show me you know how to call static methods, static members versus non-static instance members. All right, so it's that type of stuff. So as I go through here, there will be some questions. There will be a question at least on threads. Whether you have to write something that's a thread, who knows? It wouldn't be anything overly difficult if you were writing something as a thread. It would be hard for me to ask a question that got too complicated with like a, a parallel program when you have two things working simultaneously and then coming back together. So I probably wouldn't take you down a line where you were having to spend too much time on an individual programming question like that. So maybe a question dealing with threads might be more of a high level question, kind of, what they are, maybe something about the runnable interface. What's the difference between run and the start function? Remember, start is kind of your magical function in Java that does the magic behind the scenes with the operating system for actually starting the thread, those types of things. All right, so something that might pull from these next couple of slides dealing with multiple processing, this kind of stuff. All right, there will probably be a question, probably a programming question dealing with recursion, something that I give you a problem to solve and I say, it's a problem that could be solved with a loop perhaps, but I might say you must solve this recursively, something like that. Remember, recursion is a function that calls itself from within itself. We looked at it through the example of like factorial. So 5 factorial is actually 5 times 4 factorial. 4 factorial is 4 times 3 factorial, so on and so forth. All right, so it's defined in terms of itself. Similarly, I wouldn't ask you to write merge sort on the exam or anything, but remember you had significant practice with recursion dealing with merge sorts. So, recursion would certainly be a fair game and will exist in at least one question on there. I probably wouldn't ask you anything specific about the algorithm for merge sort. I might ask you to perhaps explain when would merge sort make sense versus when would it not, and kind of talk about that difference between merge sort being memory inefficient, because you just keep creating more and more memory, yet it's a pretty elegant algorithm, relatively short, something like that. But if there are other sorting algorithms that are better, but I probably would steer clear of asking specifics about merge sort and focus more on the a programming question or two dealing with recursion. Concept of interprocess communication, I guess, would be fair game. One rule of thumb you might go by when you're studying for this exam is ask yourself, does this topic and what aspects of this topic belong in a programming class versus a different course? So for instance, interprocess communication, we've talked about it from a programming perspective when we had, threads needing to communicate with each other one way or another. We've dealt with it inside of Unity with our singletons, allowing different game objects, different, things that are governed by threads to talk to each other, share information with each other. But the idea of interprocess communication under the hood, the various mechanisms for doing that feel like they're more of features of an operating system rather than programming approaches, I probably wouldn't ask things that dealt with that. When you get into CSC250 or whatever the 4-digit code for that class is, the operating systems class, you'll be talking about lots of different things with interprocess communications and the way it's pulled off through shared memory and stuff like this. Those are things that would not be useful for me to test you on in a programming class. I really want to see, are you more competent at programming today than you were at the end of 200? That's the punchline. I could ask a high level question about Unity in terms of, what problem does it solve? The idea of update versus start, for example, what purpose does the start function have? What purpose does the update function have? The idea of a rigid body for, gravity stuff. So things that go along with what we've talked about in Unity, but more of a focus on, for instance, like model view controller for design patterns. So maybe how does Unity accomplish that? But what is the generic idea of model view controller? Keeping your data separated from your logic, separated from your interface. That idea, and how does Unity accomplish that? Similarly, we talked about singletons. So from a design pattern perspective, what problem does a singleton solve and why might we use it and that kind of stuff. If I need a fill-in question, I do like polymorphism mostly because I like the word, but just this idea that there does exist multiple functions with the same name that takes a different number and or type of parameter. We've seen this actively inside of Unity, where there might be 2 or 3 versions of a function that take different inputs. Like they took, when we were looking at random range either last time or the time before that, we saw that there's 2 versions of random range, one that takes in floats, and it gives you a number between the first number and the second number inclusive of both, but another one that took in ints that gave you a number between the first int and the second int, but not including that second int, which I thought was interesting, why one of them was inclusive and one of them was not. I wouldn't ask you a specific question like that, like is something inclusive or not inclusive. That's more of a memorization. Look it up in a book, test it real quick, move on with life. But the idea that you can write a function with the same name and have it either return something different or take a different number and or type of parameters, and those are then viewed as different functions, unique functions, even though they have the same name. So that's what polymorphism is. Certainly the concept of blocking versus non-blocking, kind of an important thing specifically with multi-threaded programming, but really right now when we're dealing with Unity, we're just living in a multi-threaded world, right? Everything is happening kind of at the same time, and we've seen recently that almost everything is non-blocking, or at least we run into that much more commonly, where in Java, if we wanted something to be non-blocking, we had to force the issue with a thread. Certainly understand the idea of a game object. So in Unity, game objects are kind of like our generic object in C++ or Java, where these guys have kind of this minimal thing that they represent. So a game object in Unity only has a transform, which is a position, a rotation, and a scale. Nothing else. You can't even see it. All right, so that's the bare bones of a game object. So with that in mind, be able to work with transforms, understand this concept of a vector 3. I probably wouldn't ask you a Unity question that relates and you having to have memorized kind of a one-off type thing. Like if I wanted you to, if I said here's 2 game objects, write the necessary code to make one game object face the other one or something, I would give you like, here's the function header for Unity of the look at function of vector 3 that you can then plug in and show me how to leverage that function rather than you pulled it out of your head, the right name of the function. Make sense? So I'm not a big advocate of memorizing large aspects of languages, but I do want to see your programming ability under the hood. Concept of mono behavior versus a normal object. This is a kind of an important thing for us as we are finding out how to bring our normal objects into existence inside of a context of Unity. Yet we have these default scripts in Unity that are mono behaviors that are meant to hang off of our components. And they therefore have like the start function and the update function, these types of things that get called automatically. So whenever we want something to exist specifically for logic, we usually strip it of its mono behaviorness and then use it as a normal object. No longer can you connect it to a game object then, but we use it from within inside of our other scripts for creating instances of it and doing some other things. And hopefully you were able to explore some of that for the homework due today. Idea of event-driven programming. This would be something kind of like responding to a trigger. If we have a collider that is set up as a trigger, you become aware of an event, right? So built into Unity, we have, the natural physics aspect of things. So for instance, when you drop your guy onto the floor and he's a rigid body with a collider, well, it doesn't have to be a rigid body, but he is a collider and the floor has a collider and those colliders are not set up as triggers. We don't write the code that keeps the dude from falling through the floor. We rely on Unity handling the real life-esque physics. of that. But when we choose to use triggers, we're basically saying, look, I don't want you to make these guys bounce off each other or whatever. I want to have the opportunity to programmatically handle the idea that these two colliders touched each other. Make some sense? All right, so that's the idea of event-driven programming. I mean, it's possible if I'm looking for a one-off question. The exam will be primarily programming, but I would say there's probably going to be a maybe 6 programming questions and 4 questions that are less programming. I try to think about the exam should take you roughly an hour, probably roughly 50 minutes, as if we were taking in class, but I don't like exams to be a time pressure. I want to see what you're capable of as opposed to what you were able to squeeze into a time period. With that in mind, remember it is closed book, closed note. So I don't really want you out there Googling stuff and things like that. I want to see what you're capable of. And you should be able to see what you're capable of so you know where you need to work harder and that kind of stuff. But so there would be an opportunity possibly for me to ask you kind of a short answer question where I say, explain to me the concept of event-driven programming. If I kind of feel like I've asked you enough programming questions where, you've spent enough time on this, where at this point, time is going to become a problem. So I might ask you some competency questions that, like, what is event-driven programming? Give me an example or something like that. I suppose the concept of a vector 2 versus a vector 3, but I just can't imagine any example where I'd use vector 2s on the exam. Vector 3s are like our bread and butter type thing with Unity. So understand what a vector 3 is. It's an array that holds 3 elements. It typically labels them as X, Y, and Z, but you can use them for wherever you want. It holds 3 floats. Put in there what you want. All right. I could ask a question about generics. This would probably be a fairly compatible question with kind of explain to me the concept of something, because it's one of those things that's a little bit difficult to ask you to write some code that does it. I mean, we've done it. Like if we need to get the rigid body programmatically from a game object, we would say rigid body RB equals, we'd say our game object dot get component, and we put those little angle brackets and we say we want the rigid body. That's the generics piece of that. That will have the element come out instead of as a generic component, it'll come out as a rigid body. All right. So generics allow us to create kind of generic objects that can become more specific when the user utilizes the generic syntax with those angles. And I gave an example from Java here with this thing called array list. So array list is an object-oriented version of an array, a collection. And if you just create a plain Jane array list like this, and you put a string in there, that string will come out as a generic object. Even though we know what we put in the box was a string, when we take it out of the box, it's this generic blob. Think of it as kind of being kind of blurred out. And not until we inspect it more closely do we recognize again that, oh, that guy was a string. All right. So we can take an approach of casting it back to a string, or some other object if it was a different kind of object we put in there, like a room object or something. Or we could use generics here and say, look, I'm building an array list specifically for holding this kind of object, strings, for example. All right. And then when you remove it from the array list, it will come out as that type of object rather than a generic object like object. All right. Makes some sense? But this might be one of those questions that is more of a explain to me this concept. So almost like basically what I just said in your own kind of words or whatever. Kind of a hard question to ask a programming question about. Certainly the concept of design patterns. So I could see that also existing as kind of a short answery type question, like what's the purpose of a design pattern? Are design patterns implementations or suggestions? Something like that. Tell me some information about it. Remember, design pattern doesn't say this is how you write it. This says this is the problem it's solving. All right, so we see how Unity handles MVC. Android handles MVC itself, Android Studio. Visual Studio has its own version of its implementation of MVC, with the design pattern MVC ultimately saying it's a good idea to keep those three things separate, but different tools accomplish that in different ways. All right. Certainly the concept of a prefab, again, that might be one of those short answer questions. Why would you make a prefab? Something like that. Probably wouldn't fit into the model of a programming question I would ask you, because I probably wouldn't get too deep into something very Unity-esque. Not that I won't ask you to code something Unity-based, but I wouldn't go that deep into Unity on an exam. I really want to see your generic programming logic ability. Know about colliders. Understand the concept of time delta time. I would say this would be kind of a short answer one. Important to understand that every time you call time.delta time, it gives you the amount of time that has elapsed since the last time you called time.delta time. Okay, so it gives you the ability to handle something over time based on however many frames per second your game is running at. All right. What's the singleton design pattern? Be able to kind of write one, understand it's filled up with static elements. All right, then we start getting into our code. I suppose I could ask you a question of Git versus GitHub, something like, what is this tool used for? What's the difference between those two things? You know, Git is our local application for managing your repository on your computer, whereas GitHub happens to be a website that knows how to store Git repositories. All right, and why you might use those, something like that. I wouldn't ask you about specific commands or anything with Git, just more of what's the problem this guy is solving for you. This is very much an industry standard type thing. Maybe another high level question that deals with coroutines. This would probably fall into the category of talk to me about threads, without necessarily giving them an identity, that we're talking about the concept of a thread in Java versus a concept of a thread in Unity. Unity calls its threads coroutines. Java calls them threads, but this is the idea of you saying, I want this to happen in the background, but not as part of one of the other things that are automatically happening in the background in Unity. Whereas in Java, maybe the focus is a little bit more on the blocking versus non-blocking thing when working with threads, since Java, kind of your default behavior is things block. Where in Unity, it's a little bit more fluid than that. Call it a 50-50 shot of whether something's blocking or not. This is more of an interesting thing. I probably wouldn't test you over this. This is kind of just getting you starting to think as we're having to get creative with our game here, that there might be different points in time that we might want to interject some logic into our program. And for example, we might want to do one thing as soon as the script is enabled. We might want to do another thing at the point when the script actually starts. When it starts, this thing's already on the screen, that type of thing. But I won't ask you questions specific about this. It's more of just getting your mind wrapped around kind of this problem-solving concept, because it exists in all of our modern tools. If you're writing iPhone or Android apps, you have various entry points. Like in iPhone, you know, on view begin would be when the thing you're currently looking at shows up on the screen. You know, on view is about to show up. So before you see it, but it's just about to appear on the screen. You might want to have some stuff, maybe it, you know, start some timer at that point in time, whatever. So different applications, they all have this concept of giving you multiple entry points where you have an opportunity to interject some logic as part of the normal flow of logic in the thing. Okay, and then my tests are always the same, 10 questions. They're all short answer programming, no multiple choice, no true false. I don't want you using notes or the internet or anything. I want you to, you know, show me what you understand. I'm not going to take off points if you know, use a capital S for string instead of a lowercase s for string. I'm really grading on competence here. And as long as I pretty much know what you're trying to get at, I'm not going to take off points for little syntax problems. Probably don't just say, make up a function name that solves the problem for question 7 on the exam. That probably was not going to get you very many points. When in doubt, write something funny. Sometimes I'll throw you a pity point. And some of you have seen that before I do it. All right. So questions about the exam. All right. So like I said, I will try to have it up tonight. And as soon as it's up, I'll send out an announcement. I think it probably puts an announcement anyway, so you might get 2 announcements. And then you can just choose when you want to do it, but you have to do it all in a single sitting. And probably don't do this in groups. You know, frankly, at the end of the day, I don't actually care. You're only cheating yourself. So, but do yourself a favor and show yourself how well you understood the material. Show me it too, but at the end of the day, you get a full do-over on the final exam if you do terrible on this. All right. So I think it'll be a good exercise for you to assess how much you're getting out of the homework, or how much you're relying on other people, or how much you're trying to go solo and not asking for help when you need it and just banging your head on the wall for a month. Good.
Still have like regular class.
Yeah. This week, normal class Wednesday, normal class Friday. Check your announcements, I think, on the Friday class, maybe, to see if we'll be online or not. I got to see how this week unpacks with the drama. But we will have class Wednesday. We will have class Friday. After break, you will have class Monday and Wednesday, but they'll exist in a pre-recorded lecture. Watch it, do the homework assignment. I will grade the assignments while I'm not here, so you will get feedback for it. The assignments might be a little bit of different nature. Maybe I won't give an assignment until that Wednesday, even as I'm saying it, because typically I solve the assignment on the next class. So maybe what I'll do is I'll have the Monday, Wednesday lecture be related, but no assignment on that Monday back. Instead, there'll be assignment from on Wednesday due Friday when I'm back, and then we'll solve that in class. All right. So I won't be here for the Monday, Wednesday class after break, but we have class, and it'll probably be up before break. I think I mentioned I might just stay after on Friday and just keep trucking and record that in 2 different 50-minute chunks, so they're linked to each other. All right, other questions? Okie dokie. So let's look at this homework and start talking about how we might approach this. Now, one thing I'll throw out there is, at this point, we're starting to transition into what I would consider the most important part, the most important piece of us using Unity for the second half of the course. You know, up to this point, after we got through merge sort and stuff like that, we've kind of been getting up to speed with Unity as a tool. But I feel like at this point, we probably have a fairly decent handle on kind of the Unity basics, you know, that kind of thing. At the end of the day, I don't care if your game looks fancy or doesn't look fancy. Some of you are going to really care about that. Some of the assignments, I can go and look at the assets you reference. I can tell you've built these very elaborate games with animations and stuff, things we didn't necessarily discuss. That's great. But I focus a lot more on the programming stuff under the hood. And that's where we're really getting into it now. Where we have these data structures that exist behind the scenes. So for instance, maybe a collection of rooms that link to each other, and these are programmatically stored, and then we make our visual interface match what's behind the scenes. Make sense? So really the coding aspect of this is the behind the scenes part. And then if we're in a room and we go to the west, it figures out which programmatic room is to the west, and it makes sure that your user interface shows the room as it should be with the correct exits, that kind of stuff. Okay, so let's, what I say to do? Keep track of the existing rooms that have been built to make sure that if a player exits in a particular direction, the next room allows them to go back to the previous room. Fine. All right. This means that rooms should only be randomly generated the first time. So this is part of the problem solving with this, and we'll talk about this at least today. They should be loaded from our array of rooms in the singleton otherwise. So if you've already visited this room, if you chose to design the room as you were entering it, if it didn't already exist, which I think you're going to see today, that probably is not the way you should have chosen, or at least there's a better approach. You should only create the room randomly the very first time. After that, it should load the existing room because, you know, as we start having monsters and stuff inhabit our game, that might be important. Okay, and I said you only had to really make this work for 2 rooms initially, just to kind of get that mechanic of bouncing back and forth between some rooms. Okay, so what I want to think about here is, what if we have a dungeon object? Okay, so now a dungeon object might have a room called start room. Okay, so it has a room called start room. And so this is the room that you first enter the dungeon in, the opening door to the dungeon. So everybody who enters this dungeon comes into this room, unless they were teleported into the dungeon in some other room once the game becomes amazing. But generally speaking, a dungeon has a starting room. Okay. Now we want to I'm going to upgrade our room object. So we're going to say room upgraded. So I won't get rid of the old one. I'll just we'll update the real one in code. I just won't drag it through the slide deck. I'll leave it where it was before, but now we're going to put it down here. So we already have a room keeping track of its name. I don't even think we do a description at this point, right? It doesn't matter. So a room keeps track of its name. Now a room also has a collection of exits. Okay, so a collection of exits are the directions that exist leading out from this room. We can decide what the nature of that collection of exits will be shortly. All right, so we have this idea of a collection of exits. We can say this could exist as an array of up to 4 rooms. That might be how we want to accomplish this. All right, so I'm going to go ahead. I'll just duplicate it. So if we go back to our original dungeon design from last semester, and we start thinking about how we want this guy to actually work. We have this room. So this might be our start room. So room, start room is equal to a new room, and we'll call this guy R1 for this example. Okay. So that's our start room. Now, room 1 has an exit to the north that leads to room 2, right? So it has a single exit, a single door. So maybe we have something that does something along these lines. We say start room dot add exit to the north, something like that. All right, and what that will do, and here for right now, I'm actually going to get rid of all of our extra little exits here so we can kind of reimagine what that might be this time around when we're bringing Unity into it. So at this point in time, we can think of all these as just separate instances of rooms, right? So we have 6 rooms that exist in this dungeon. So we have our first room. And we might go ahead and create the rest of our rooms. 4, 5, 6. All right, so we'll say R2 is room R2. R3 is room R3. R4 R4, R5, 5, and R6 is room R6. All right, so once we have all of our rooms, and this should look a little bit familiar to something we did last semester. And here I'm gonna get rid of that. I'm gonna create another text box. Perfect. All right, so now we might say something like start room dot add exit to the north, and this guy leads to room R2. Similar, R2 dot add exit to the south leads to, technically in this case, it's start room. All right. We could have named it R1 if we wanted. Let's just do that so we don't confuse the issue. And we'll just have R1 set as the start room. I think you'll see what I mean here. So I'm going to say dungeon P is equal to a new dungeon. This guy the cross. And then we might do something like D set start room is equal to R1. All right, so here's me creating an instance of a dungeon. I give a dungeon a name. I then let that dungeon know about its start room. What room does this dungeon start with? If I first enter the room, where does it start? In this case, we start in R1. All right, then I start building out the reality of my dungeon. So I can say R1, add exit to the north, leading to R2. R2, add exit to the south, heading to R1. R2, add exit to the north, heading to R3. R3, add exit to the south, going to R2. R3, add exit to the west, going to R4. R3, add exit. Actually, let's keep letting it grow organically. So then we'll say, well, let's do all the R3s, I guess. R3 dot add exit to the north, heading to R6. R3, add exit to the east, heading to R5. Then we're going to say R4, add exit to the east, heading to R3. R5, add exit to the west, heading to R3. And R6, add exit to the south, heading to R3. All right, something like that. All right, so that means that a dungeon has a name and literally holds, well, at least at this point, literally holds a single room. That is the first room of the dungeon. It is that room that then holds another room. And that room then holds other rooms. And that room then holds other rooms, so on and so forth. Okay? And this is dealing with pointers to this room. So R1 has a pointer to R2. R2 has a pointer back to R1. It also has a pointer to R3. R3 has a pointer to R2. It has a pointer to R4, a pointer to R6, and a pointer to R5. R6 has a pointer to R3. R4 has a pointer to R3. R5 has a pointer to R3, so on and so forth. So we might have the same pointer being held by multiple rooms because they're leading back to the same room, but these guys only exist one time. That's the point of pointers, I guess, unintended, something like that. All right. So does this make sense? Maybe an approach to this. So when our game first loads, when we have that very first scene launch, we might have this dungeon generate itself. You could either, randomly generate it if you wanted, where it just decides what exits it goes to, or if you want to hard code in something with a relatively small dungeon like this, that's fine as well. It's going to be the same problem solving after the dungeon is generated anyways. So you can always solve it this way initially and then go back and decide, well, how could I randomly generate this each time I launch the game rather than them being able to memorize the dungeon. All right. So with this in mind, just to kind of get the ball rolling here, what we'll go ahead and do is in our project, inside of scripts, material scenes. I'm going to go ahead. We have our dungeon controller, which is our kind of another part of this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a folder in here. And we're going to call this guy, normal class scripts versus a folder for mono behavior scripts. All right. So we have to think about what these different guys are. So our dungeon controller, this is a mono behavior script. My singleton, not a mono behavior. So this guy would go inside the normal class. Player is inside the normal class. Room is inside the normal class. And sphere script is a mono behavior. I don't remember what we have that attached to right now. Actually, nothing. It's not doing anything right now. So I'll just go ahead and delete that. Okay, so just organizing things a little bit so we can kind of keep track of which things are hanging off game objects and which things are kind of our back end programming stuff. So when you start looking at programming jobs and you see things like full stack development, front end programming, back end programming. So full stack would say you're handling all the different levels. You're handling the front end, which is your user interface, making things look pretty. You're handling the back end, which is like our, variables for like our dungeon and our rooms, the logic stuff that you don't necessarily see, but might be the driving force behind what things you see and what things you don't see. All right. So that would be back end development. So we're going to be playing the role of both, where we're creating these amazing dungeon scenes. And then we also have the back end stuff, which is really more of the normal programming logic stuff. Okay, so I'm going to go into my normal class here, and I'm going to start off by creating a C# script, and we're just going to call this guy dungeon. And I'll go ahead and jump in there. This guy is not going to be a mono behavior. We'll get rid of the update. We're going to say private string name, private room, start room. And then we might have our constructor for dungeon. That takes in a string name. And we say this dot name is equal to name. And then we might have our public void set start room. And this guy takes an R room as a parameter. And we say this dot start room is equal to whatever they passed in. something like that. All right, so that's going to be where we start next time, where we start fleshing out our dungeon. Because now that we have these rooms, we'll have to make sure these other rooms get built. We'll have to decide where we're going to put that. We're going to have these rooms linked to each other, and then we're going to connect up our interface so that if I'm in that first room, all I see is an exit to the north. If I go to the north, I'll see an exit back to the south, as well as another exit to the north. Basically, having our front end user interface create this as a reality, even though we're supporting it in the back end with all of these instances linking them together. Make some sense? All right, questions, comments, concerns, bribes. All right, I'll see everybody on Wednesday.
Professor.
Player controller, I think, is a mono behavior, right? No, you might be right. You're probably right. Yeah. Yeah, well, it's definitely a mono behavior. So, yeah, so really, if we were following naming conventions, that guy should probably be player controller. But you are right.
Professor.
What's up?
You said we don't have class this Wednesday, or is that
No, we
next
do.
week?
We have class
Okay.
this Wednesday. We have class this Friday. It's after break. We will not
Okay.
on Monday, and we will not meet on Wednesday, but there will be lectures for both of those. And I'll send
Okay.
out reminders about that. But this
Okay,
week,
and then all right, sweet. And then this week Friday, I won't be here because I will be at regionals in Stevens Point for wrestling.
okay, well, watch
So I
the
just want to let you know.
video.
Okay, sweet. Thank you so much.
Yep, take care.
You too.
Yeah, I show up and I show. In that dude. Showed up one day.
Okay.
And I talked. So I've been looking at